Hello and welcome back, adventurers. This is Captain TTRPG, and today we're talking about Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Welcome back, adventurers. I guess we need to stop lying and try to make some friends with diplomacy. Diplomacy is how we interact with others in a positive manner this time and improve our reputation with them. It allows us to make requests, gather information, and even sling an insult or two if we find we have a need for it and have the wit. There are only untrained actions for diplomacy, no trained actions. However, there are actions we gain from feats, and one of those in particular may be interesting in combat. But for now, let's check out the untrained actions everyone has at level 1. We are starting off here with the untrained action of gather information, and this usually takes 2 hours, but it's up to the GM. So what are you doing with gather information? You are choosing an individual or a topic and gathering information in a locale about that. You can then spend some time, so you speak to town folks, you stop by the markets, maybe bribe some people, and finally you make a diplomacy check against a DC that the GM has set based on what it is you're trying to find out information about. If you succeed, the GM will give you the relevant information. If you fail, you're not going to collect anything, and if you critically fail, well, you're going to get some incorrect info, so be a little bit careful. Now, this is a secret check that only the GM does, so you don't actually know if you've succeeded, succeeded, critically failed. So just be aware of that. GMs, be careful how you handle this. I personally don't like completely secret checks, and I prefer to at least let the player see their D20 roll, even if they don't know the DC, so that at least they get some feeling on if people are telling them the truth or not. Because I feel like you would actually have some idea if people are giving you correct information while you're going about doing this anyway. All right, so we've gathered information. What's next? Next up is make an impression. And this is a 1-minute activity. This is what we most often think of as like the primary purpose of diplomacy, which is great. You chat somebody up, you flatter them maybe, perhaps you bribe them, I don't know. You can make an impression with up to 5 people at once, with a -2 penalty to the roll at the end, or you can just do the one person and not take a penalty. The outcome only affects them as long as you remain in conversation with them, unless the GM says otherwise. So you don't get to hold on to how they feel about you long after. You're not coming back 3 weeks later in the same impression. After a minute, you roll a diplomacy check against the target's will DC, or all the targets. On a crit success, their attitude towards you increases by 2 steps. Now, there's a whole attitude system. I haven't covered it. There's great stuff out there about it. I'll even put a link in this video's description for somewhere I would go check it out. But just know it increases by 2 levels. On a success, it goes up by 1. And on a critical failure, it's actually going to go down by 1. So be a little bit careful and make sure you have a good diplomacy. GMs, I recommend that you allow the attitude change to last more than just for this conversation. I really think it's impactful when, at least some of it affects later on, depending on maybe even just what they say. You can add more into it, but it's more interesting, I think, when the effect lasts more than just this conversation. All right, and finally, we have request. This is actually a single action. You make a request of someone that is already friendly or helpful towards you. Again, that attitude system. These are the 2 positive attitudes above neutral. How you frame the request will adjust the GM's DC. So you actually have to come up with the request yourself. The GM can choose to make it impossible if the request doesn't even make sense. So, maybe don't request that a king replace himself with you as new king. Probably not going to happen. A crit success means that they are going to accept what you said without stipulation. Just, you got it. Pie is yours. Have fun. A success is yes, but with some provisions or adjustments. You can have a piece of the pie, assuming that next time you talk to my friend over there, you mention how good the pie was. A failure means that they refuse, but might make you a different suggestion. No, you can't have any pie, but if you go talk to that person and they seem to smile at me, then maybe I'd give you pie. And a crit failure means they refuse and their attitude decreases. How dare you wish for my award-winning pie? No, keep your grubby hands away. GMs, just make sure to hear out the intent of the player with their request before deciding if it's impossible or not. It might sound reasonable to the player and it's not going to be, so you can just tell them that so they don't waste their time. Again, this is a game big on communication. Just have that discussion. There's no point in people wasting their time when they think it shouldn't be a waste of time. sometimes they want it to be a waste of time. And then you can let that happen. As you can see, all of these untrained actions are for social encounters or exploration mode. So what about combat? I keep saying that every skill can be used in combat in some way, at least one or two uses if nothing else. So let's talk about the feats and talk about what they can do for you in combat, if anything. All right, Bargain Hunter. Starting us off, level 1, trained in diplomacy. You can earn income by shopping around and saving money on things you purchase rather than gaining money outright. And this is kind of funny. I think we all know people who do this in real life. It doesn't really count as gaining money, but saving on things is important too. So go out there and hunt down your bargains. Bon mot. This is level 1, trained, and it is 1 action. You quip at a creature within 30 feet, rolling diplomacy against its will DC. On a success or crit success, you reduce the creature's perception checks and will saves. The creature has to spend an action to quip back, or the condition lasts for 1 minute. On a crit fail, though, you get debuffed until you successfully quip in the future. So you're probably only doing this if you have a high diplomacy anyway. I wouldn't worry too much about the crit failure, but this is just kind of funny. So if you really want to be that charismatic, quippy person on the battlefield and think you can outwit your enemies, this can be amazing. And also, don't forget that when you decrease a creature's will saves, that's really effective for some of your spellcasters to take advantage of. So this can be great on a martial character that's got high charisma to set up for their spellcasting friend to come in and destroy the enemies. Group Impression. Level 1, trained in diplomacy. You can now try to impress 10 people instead of 5 at once, and the -2 penalty goes away entirely. You can do 20 people at expert, 50 at master, and 100 at legendary. Basically, at legendary, you can walk out in front of whatever crowd you want and just get them on your side. Very strong for certain campaigns. Hobnobber. Level 1, trained in diplomacy. You gather information activity takes only 1 hour now, and if you are at least master, you can't critically fail anymore. So if you're going to rely heavily on gaining information in cities and towns, this could be a great way with 1 feat to make sure that you're never getting bad information. No cause for alarm. Level 1, trained in diplomacy, takes 3 actions. You make a diplomacy check against the will DC of all creatures in 10 feet of you that are frightened. On a crit success, you reduce the creature's frightened condition by 2, and you reduce it by 1 on regular success. You aren't using this against enemies. This is a dragon came in and frightened all of my allies, maybe even including me. We need to get our feet back under us. So for 3 actions, reducing the frightened condition on a group of allies could be game saving. Discreet Inquiry. Level 2, we're now expert in diplomacy. When you gather information, you make it harder for others to know you were doing it. If somebody tries to identify you as the gatherer of information, they have to make a roll against your deception DC or your gather information diplomacy DC, whichever is higher, or else they won't even know that you've been trying to gather information, which, in the right campaign, can be very strong. Eyes of the City. Level 2, only trained in diplomacy. You can track creatures in settlements using diplomacy or society if you'd rather, like you would using survival in the wilderness. So this is a cool way for your urban trackers to get in on the action. Glad Hand. Level 2, expert in diplomacy. You can make a diplomacy check to make an impression immediately. No need to chat for a minute. And if you fail, you can try again in 1 minute. So normally you don't get to try again like that. So this just allows you to really make sure you land those diplomacy checks to get people on your side in conversation. Half-truths. Level 2, expert in deception and diplomacy. You can use diplomacy to make a request, and that we already covered in our deception video, but you can also use diplomacy to lie. Interesting option. It allows you to use 1 skill to cover 2, at least on some level. Entourage. Now this is rare, so again, probably not going to be allowed at your game, but check with your GM. Level 7 requires master in diplomacy and requires the Hobnobber skill feat. You have a traveling contingent of dedicated fans. They will handle simple tasks for you, like using your money to buy simple items that you want, but they won't follow you to dangerous locations. So they're not going to go with you to the nearby cave, but they'll hang out in the nearest town, and they travel with you from city location to town location and all of that. This is just kind of fun and more funny than anything, and there are certain archetypes that this is amazing for. Evangelize, level 7, Master in Diplomacy, and you need a religion or philosophy that you follow and takes 1 action. You attempt to convert a single creature within 30 feet that can understand you to your point of view about that religion or philosophy. If it already shares your view or decides to follow your view thanks to what you told them, this has no effect. Though they might be willing to do what you're asking now because they follow what you follow based on what you just told them. Otherwise, you make a diplomacy check against the creature's will DC. On a crit success, the creature is stupefied 2 for a round, and on a success, stupefied 1. This is a very odd feat, but for somebody who can really figure out how to use it, it could be extremely effective because there's not going to be too many enemies that are going to suddenly come around to your way of thinking. And if they do, great, then they're probably on your side. But if not, if you can do this to spellcasters, you can shut them down. Shameless Request. This is level 7, Master in Diplomacy. When you request something, you reduce any DC thanks to it being outrageous by 2. So now you can really throw outrageous requests out there and at least have a shot. If you roll a crit fail, you just get a regular fail instead, but the creature or person may still walk away and stop conversing with you. But at least you don't get the normal crit failure result. So, again, interesting depending on what you're trying to do. If you like to give out the outlandish requests, this is your feat. Legendary Negotiation. Level 15, Legendary in Diplomacy, and 3 actions. You can make an impression and request the creature stop whatever it is doing to negotiate with you. You have to take a -5 penalty to the check you make, but it's still against the creature's will DC, and if you've gone this far with your diplomacy, you probably still have a good shot. It may be unable to stop, that's up to the GM, but being able to stop, possibly even in combat with a creature to make it negotiate with you, in the right situations, that could make all the difference. As you can see, there are some very specific feats that grant actions or activities that you can do in combat, and I think Bon Mot is actually pretty strong, especially if you have a caster in the party who can take advantage of the reduced will saves that they're going to have. But the majority of the skills are about social interactions and how you deal with those social situations. So in those games where social is a big part of the game, this is extremely powerful. Otherwise, we've talked about the feats, and you might get value out of them, depends on how you want to play your character. The classes that easily take advantage of diplomacy, thanks to their primary ability score being charisma, just like deception, are Bard, Oracle, Psychic, Rogue, if you go with Scoundrel, Sorcerer, Summoner, and Thaumaturge. There are some other classes that have specific features or subclasses that use diplomacy in a specific way. Swashbuckler has the Wit subclass, which uses Bon Mot. Also, the Investigator has the Interrogation subclass, which not only gives you trained proficiency in diplomacy, but also you get a special diplomacy action called Pointed Question. So keep those in mind if you're thinking about either class and what your options could be. I know I talked about marshals using Bon Mot. I also just want to make a quick mention that Bon Mot is great for a spellcaster themselves because most spells you cast are 2 actions, and this is 1 action to possibly debuff a will save before dropping a giant will save bomb on somebody. So even as a spellcaster, seriously consider this. It could be a great setup and a 1-2 punch kind of deal. For the GMs, keep in mind that your players are doing their best to converse with NPCs and creatures and stay open to their attempts. Nothing wrong with it being very challenging to get certain creatures or characters on their side, but as long as they're being clever and coming up with interesting ways to converse with these creatures, I'd say reward that. At least make it possible. Also, don't worry about being too strict with the attitude system. As long as characters can act in different ways depending on how you feel it's gone, then you're doing your job. And I'd say don't be too strict on the rules here. I'm going to work on my small talk and continue to avoid speaking with anybody about anything because this is kind of how it goes. Anyway, go have fun making impressions, and as always, adventure on.